Evelyn Carrington stood in the middle of my dirt road, pointed straight at my face, and told 2 deputies she had caught a black trespasser on Bellweather Ridge property. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I leaned against my pickup and watched Deputy Reese flip through her paperwork. Evelyn smiled like the only thing left was putting cuffs on me. But minutes later, Reese looked up, glanced at her, then turned toward the orange survey stakes beyond the HOA gate. He asked one question that wiped that smile right from her face. "Ma'am, have you checked the deed?" If you are someone who enjoys watching arrogance get corrected by hard evidence, then subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. My name is Darius Holloway, and I am 48 years old. Earlier this spring, I completed the purchase of 14.7 acres of land in North Georgia, a parcel that included an old farmhouse, a timber frame storage barn, and a stretch of heavily wooded property that ran directly along the boundary of a high-end residential subdivision called Bellweather Ridge. I bought the land from a man named Warren Beckett, who had owned it for decades before age and declining health made it more than he could manage. The farmhouse had good bones, the barn was structurally sound despite years of neglect, and the land sat in a county I had been working in for years through my small property restoration company. Before going out on my own, I had spent the better part of 2 decades as a civil construction project manager. Long enough to learn how to read a survey plat, trace a parcel number through county records, interpret an easement clause, and understand precisely what a properly recorded deed was supposed to say. I was not walking into a transaction I did not fully understand. I had hired a licensed surveyor before closing, I had reviewed the title history, and I knew what I was buying and what it cost. Bellweather Ridge had been developed roughly 12 years before I arrived. It was a well-maintained community of large homes, manicured landscaping, and an entrance gate framed by an elaborate stacked stone archway that announced loudly and deliberately that the people inside had paid for something impressive. I had no issue with any of that. My property was not part of their homeowners association and had never been. The parcel I purchased predated the subdivision by several decades, and there was no covenant in my deed that bound me to their rules, their architectural standards, or their approval process. I was a private landowner with legally recorded boundaries who intended to restore a farmhouse and use the barn as a small workshop for my company. Nothing about that was complicated, and nothing about it required anyone else's permission. The first day I drove out to walk the fence line and assess what needed work, I arrived in my old Ford pickup wearing the same canvas work pants, heavy boots, and worn flannel I wore to every job site. I had been on the property for less than 15 minutes when a silver sedan pulled in from the direction of the HOA entrance and a woman stepped out with the posture of someone who fully expected to be listened to. She was well dressed, somewhere in her mid-50s, and she walked toward me with a measured, deliberate stride. The kind of walk that tells you the person at the other end of it has had this type of conversation before, to go any differently this time. She did not ask if I was the new owner. She asked who I was working for. I told her I was working for myself. She looked at the truck, at my clothes, and asked whether I had authorization to be in this area. I pointed up toward the farmhouse at the top of the rise and told her I owned it. She smiled the way people smile when they think they have caught someone in a small lie and are enjoying the moment before correcting it. When I told her that everything from the eastern tree line to the western creek belonged to me, the farmhouse, the barn, all 14.7 acres, she tilted her head and looked at me with something closer to amusement than disbelief. "Bellweather Ridge," she said, in a tone entirely too smooth to be polite, "is not the kind of place where someone just wanders in and claims things." Her name was Evelyn Carrington, president of the Bellweather Ridge HOA. In those first 3 minutes she had already decided who I was, what I was doing there, and why neither of those things belonged in her neighborhood. Not one part of that decision had anything to do with what was already recorded in my name at the county courthouse. Before she left, Evelyn pointed at the road running along the edge of my property and told me not to cross it again. The HOA owned that corridor, she said, and my presence there was unwelcome. I looked down at the ground near her feet. An orange survey stake stood in the earth about 2 feet from where she was planted. According to the certified survey I had received at closing, the actual property line ran nearly 20 feet further, on the far side of where Evelyn was standing. She was not warning me away from the edge of her territory. She was standing on my land and telling me to leave it. I did not confront her that afternoon. Confrontation without documentation is just noise, and I did not have time for noise. What I needed first was certainty about the boundary, about the easement history, and about anything that could later be used to muddy the record in a legal proceeding. I called Graham Pike, the licensed county surveyor who had performed the boundary inspection before my purchase closed. Graham was 61 years old and had been doing this work in this county longer than I had been in construction. He walked me back through the full picture in plain terms. The warranty deed was clean, properly executed, and recorded with the county. My parcel was entirely outside the Bellweather Ridge subdivision plat. There was no covenant, no declaration, and no clause in the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that brought my land under HOA jurisdiction. There had been a temporary construction easement at some point, granted to the original developer to allow equipment and material access across the edge of my parcel during the subdivision's build-out phase, but that easement had carried an explicit expiration date and had lapsed automatically by its own terms, years before I ever drove my pickup through the gate. Graham confirmed all of this in writing. My property was mine, unambiguously, with no surviving encumbrances giving Bellweather Ridge any legal claim over what I did with it. There was one detail worth noting. The maintenance road the HOA had been using for years to reach their decorative retention pond and end of community landscaping ran for a short stretch directly across a corner of my parcel. The previous owner had apparently never filed a formal objection to that use, and over time the HOA had treated it as though it were an established right. It was not. The easement that might have supported it was gone, and what remained was simply an ongoing use of private land that no one had pushed back on until now. 2 days after my conversation with Graham, I drove out and found a white sign planted on my side of the fence line, block lettering, Bellweather Ridge HOA property, no trespassing. I pulled the sign from the ground, set it aside, photographed it with my phone, and noted the date and time. The next morning there were 2 more signs. I pulled both of them and documented those as well. A few days after that, I received an envelope from the HOA addressed not to me by name but to occupant. It contained what they were calling a violation notice. I was allegedly in breach of community standards for parking a commercial vehicle in a visible location, for performing exterior modifications without architectural committee approval, and for installing fencing inconsistent with HOA guidelines. The fine was listed as $250 per day per violation. I read the letter twice. Then I set it on my workbench and sent a short direct email to the HOA contact address. My property is not part of Bellweather Ridge HOA. Please correct your records. Evelyn's response came back the same afternoon. She wrote that property ownership did not exempt neighboring properties from community standards and that the board was prepared to enforce compliance. I read that sentence again slowly. She was not confused. She was not operating on incomplete information. She had been formally informed that a dispute existed, and she had decided that the weight of fines and violations notices would accomplish what the public record could not. Getting me to give up or go away. I was not going to give up, and I was certainly not going to go away. Every communication went into a folder on my laptop. I named it Bellweather Ridge Evidence. The violation notices, the emails, the photographs of the signs with their timestamps, the deed, the easement records, everything in chronological order went into that folder. I had been in enough property disputes and project scope arguments over the years to understand one thing clearly. The person who keeps the cleanest record wins, not the loudest voice, not the most aggressive letter. The person who can show a dated, documented, unbroken chain of events beginning on day 1. I saved the folder and went back to work on the farmhouse. About a week after the sign removal, I was resetting a section of the northern fence line. Routine job, just leveling a few posts that had heaved over a hard winter, when Evelyn arrived in her car with a second vehicle behind her. The passenger of the second car was a heavy-set man in business casual clothes named Keith Larkin, a member of the HOA board of directors. They walked over together, and Evelyn told me to stop what I was doing. I said the fence was inside my parcel. She asked to see my paperwork. I looked at her for a moment and then said, calmly and without particular emphasis, "Do you ask every white homeowner in this neighborhood to produce their deed before they work on their own fence line?" Keith went quiet immediately. Evelyn went defensive just as fast. She said race had nothing to do with it, that this was about compliance, about community standards, about a situation the board had every right to address. I let her finish. Then I asked again, more simply, which board-certified survey she was relying on to determine that any fence I was building was out of compliance. She did not answer that question. The conversation continued in that pattern for a few minutes, her making statements, me asking which documents they were based on, her declining to cite any. Then she looked at the farmhouse, at the barn, at the cleared stretch of fence line I was working on, and she said something that explained everything I needed to understand about where this was really coming from. "Do you honestly expect me to believe that one person owns all of this?" She was not asking about a deed. She was asking me to justify my presence in a way that had nothing to do with any recorded document. I told her, without raising my voice, "I don't need you to believe anything. The county already recorded it. That answer landed badly on her. She was accustomed to being the definitive voice on who owned what in this area, and I was treating that voice as legally irrelevant, not out of rudeness, but because, in any proceeding that actually mattered, it was. She warned me that if I continued encroaching on HO common property, their attorney would handle the matter. I asked her to identify the specific common property she was referring to and on the basis of which survey. She did not answer. Instead, she said the HOA had managed and maintained this land for years and that everyone in the community understood it belonged to Bellweather Ridge. That was the most revealing thing she said in that entire conversation. Not a legal argument, not a deed citation, not a survey reference, just an appeal to habit and collective memory. She had confused the fact of long uncontested use with the legal concept of ownership, and she was not interested in examining the gap between them. It was around that time that I encountered Lydia Vaughn. She was a long-term Bellweather Ridge resident who had been in the community since close to its founding. I met her briefly at the local hardware store, and she pulled me aside in the parking lot. She told me quietly that Warren Beckett, the man I had bought the property from, had complained to the HOA about their encroachment more than once over the years. His health had eventually made fighting it feel like more trouble than it was worth, and he had stopped. Evelyn had learned, through that experience and others like it, that persistence without pushback was functionally the same as having rights. Lydia warned me carefully. She is not going to stop on her own. I appreciated the warning. I told her I understood, and I told her that this time Evelyn was going to be dealing with an owner who was not going to stop on his own either. That night, the motion-activated camera I had mounted to the corner of my barn, one of 3 I had installed when I first took possession of the property, recorded a white maintenance vehicle, clearly marked with the Bellweather Ridge HOA logo on its door panel, driving down the access road and entering my parcel after dark. The footage was not sharp enough to identify the individual who stepped out, but the vehicle itself was unmistakable. By the following morning, 3 of the survey stakes Graham had set were gone, pulled from the ground, with only the shallow depressions they had occupied left behind. I did not go to Evelyn with the footage. I did not send an angry email. I had no clear visual identification of the individual who had touched the stakes, and I was not going to make a specific accusation against a specific person without being able to fully back it up. What I did was call Graham Pike and ask him to come back out and reset the markers with GPS coordinates precisely logged and certified in writing. Graham drove out 2 days later, and while he was resetting the boundary line, he took the opportunity to do a more thorough review of the conditions along the full perimeter. What he found went considerably beyond what either of us had focused on before. It was not just the maintenance road that crossed my parcel, the stacked stone entrance archway at the main Bellweather Ridge gate, the ornamental structure that had clearly cost a substantial sum to construct and that announced the community's name to everyone on the county road, extended past my property line by approximately 11 feet at its deepest point. Beyond that, a section of decorative landscaping along the entrance border, an underground irrigation line feeding that landscaping, 2 lampposts with their concrete footings, and a portion of the community's main identification sign were all sitting, according to its survey, within my parcel boundaries. None of it belonged to me in the sense of who had built it or who maintained it. All of it belonged to me in the sense of whose legally recorded land it was physically occupying. I did not touch any of it. I needed every structure to remain exactly where it was, in exactly the condition it was in, so that no one could later claim I had damaged or altered community property during the dispute. Graham strongly advised me to retain an attorney before making any formal move, and I had been thinking the same thing since the violation notice arrived on my workbench. I retained a real estate attorney experienced in Georgia property law and familiar with easement and boundary conflicts in this county. His first action was a formal notice of boundary dispute sent to the Bellweather Ridge HOA board. The letter made 4 requests: cease all access to and use of my parcel without prior written permission, refrain from removing, moving, or disturbing any survey markers on the property, provide any deed, recorded plat, or current professional survey supporting the ownership claims they had been asserting, and confirm receipt in writing within 10 business days. Evelyn did not respond with documentation. She responded by sending a letter to the entire HOA membership describing what she called a hostile neighboring land occupant who was threatening community property and undermining neighborhood securities. She avoided using my name, but I was the only neighboring land occupant at issue, and every resident understood exactly who she meant. I began receiving hard looks from people I had never spoken to when I drove past the HOA entrance on the county road. I kept working on the farmhouse. I kept documenting every communication. I added nothing public in response to Evelyn's letter, no rebuttal, no call to the community, no statement of any kind. Every morning I went to work and every evening I updated the evidence folder. 3 days after the letter went out, I was replacing a section of split-rail fence near the southern edge of the property when I heard an engine accelerating on the access road. Evelyn's white SUV came around the bend and stopped about 30 yards from where I was working. She stepped out, held her phone up in one hand with the manner of someone delivering consequences, and told me she had called the deputies. I looked down at the orange survey stake a few feet from my boots. The new one Graham had GPS certified and officially logged, dated, and documented. Then I looked back up at Evelyn. "Good," I said. I meant it without any performance behind it. I had been building toward this moment every single day since the first violation notice arrived, and I had been adding to that folder in anticipation of exactly this kind of reckoning. 2 county vehicles came down the access road about 12 minutes after Evelyn made her call. Deputy Nolan Reese stepped out of the first one, and Deputy Marin Cole came around from the passenger side. Reese scanned the scene, no visible threat, 2 people standing on opposite sides of a fence line, and signaled both of us to step back and give him room to work. Cole had her notepad out before she reached the fence. They were professional, methodical, and clearly not interested in taking anyone's account of the situation at face value without examining the documentation behind it. That professionalism was exactly what the moment called for, and I was glad to see it. Evelyn moved immediately. She told Reese that the man at the fence had repeatedly trespassed on Bellweather Ridge property, and that despite multiple formal notices, he had continued to occupy land belonging to the association. She delivered all of it confidently and without hesitation in the smooth, authoritative tone of someone who had never been seriously questioned in this context before. Then she added, for emphasis, "He doesn't live here." Reese looked at me. I said, without drama, that she was correct. I did not live in the HOA. My property was right there, and I pointed at the farmhouse. Evelyn immediately cut in. "That doesn't make this his land." Reese held up a hand and asked both of us to let him and Deputy Cole do their work before either of us made further statements. He then asked Evelyn whether she had ownership for the specific land in question, a deed, a recorded plat, a current professional survey showing their boundary extended to where we were standing. She opened a folder and handed him a stack of papers. Reese and Cole went through it together quietly for a few minutes. What she had provided was the Bellweather Ridge subdivision plat, a copy of the HOA bylaws, and a set of internal maintenance maps. What was not in the folder was a deed identifying any parcel that included the ground where all 4 of us were currently standing. Then Evelyn looked directly at me, in front of both deputies, and said something she apparently could not stop herself from saying even in that context. She said that she had already made her position clear and that someone like me could not simply walk onto property like this and declare it mine. Reese looked up from his notepad. "Someone like him?" he asked, very quietly. Evelyn stopped. She adjusted her phrasing, said she was referring to unauthorized individuals and trespassers in general, and moved past it. Reese accepted the clarification and continued. But the adjustment had not gone unnoticed by anyone standing there. A few minutes later, when I had still not raised my voice or made any aggressive statement, when I had simply answered questions and pointed at my property, composure reached a pressure point. She turned to Reese and said with a plainness that I do not believe she intended to be quite as explicit as it came out, "I called because there is a black trespasser refusing to leave our land." No one moved for a moment. I did not react. I did not change my expression. I looked at Deputy Cole, who had also heard it clearly and whose pen had gone still on the notepad. The statement sat in the air between all 4 of us without anyone reaching in to walk it back. Evelyn seemed to understand a second or two after the words left her what she had just placed on the public record, with 2 law enforcement officers present and every word being written down. I turned to Deputy Reese and said calmly and without any inflection, "Officer, I have a deed in my truck." Evelyn's response was immediate. "Anyone can print paperwork." It was the kind of statement you make when you have run out of real arguments and are reaching for something that sounds dismissive. Reese looked at her steadily, with the patience of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. "Ma'am," he said, "that is exactly why we are going to look at it." Cole walked with me to the truck. I reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the sealed envelope I had placed there the day Graham finished the updated survey, because I had known, from the moment Evelyn first told me to leave my own land, that one day I was going to be handing this to exactly this kind of person, in exactly this kind of moment. I handed Deputy Cole a warranty deed, the full set of closing documents, the certified boundary survey signed and sealed by Graham Pike, the parcel identification number assigned by the county assessor's office, and a copy of the recorded county plat showing the complete legal description of my property. Cole organized them on the hood of the truck, worked through each document methodically, and began cross-referencing against what Evelyn had provided. Reese stood beside her, following the comparison. Evelyn stood a few feet back with her arms folded, maintaining the posture of someone who was still waiting for the moment things resolved in her favor. Cole pulled up the county property record system on the mobile terminal in the vehicle and entered my parcel identification number. The system returned the record. She read it to herself first, then said aloud, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Owner of record, Darius Holloway. Transfer recorded in March. Then she looked at Evelyn. Evelyn said immediately that the county system might not have been updated correctly, that there could be a processing delay that sometimes took additional time to appear in the public database. Cole pointed out, without particular emphasis, that a warranty deed formally executed, notarized, and recorded at the county courthouse was not a preliminary or provisional document. It was the legal instrument of title. It was indexed in the public record, and it currently reflected my name as the owner of the parcel where all four of them were standing. Reese had moved over to the survey and was walking the line. He moved from stake to stake, comparing the legal description in the deed to the markers on the ground, cross-referencing GPS coordinates against what was printed on Graham's certified document. Then he walked to the far edge of the parcel, passed the last stake, and stood at the entrance to the Bellweather Ridge gate. He spent a long moment looking at the stacked stone archway, at the landscaping border running alongside it, at the placement of the iron gate itself, and the concrete footings of the decorative lamp posts. Then he turned back and asked Evelyn whether she had a survey more recent than the one I had provided. She did not. He asked whether she had a deed for the specific parcel she was claiming ownership over. She did not. He asked whether she had a valid current easement authorizing HOA access to the maintenance road across my land. She produced the temporary construction easement from the original subdivision development. Cole took it, found the expiration clause, checked the date, and confirmed what Graham had already told me. The easement had lapsed by its own terms years before I ever purchased the property. The dynamic of the conversation had reversed completely and without any drama. The person being asked to justify presence with documentation was no longer me. Every question Reese asked was now a question Evelyn could not answer with a piece of paper, and each gap in her folder was landing differently than the confident stride she had arrived with. He asked her, in the same level tone he had maintained throughout, why the HOA had continued to place signs and send maintenance vehicles onto the parcel after receiving formal written notice from my attorney that a boundary dispute existed. Evelyn said the HOA's legal counsel would address that question in the appropriate forum. Reese said that might be, but that the recorded documentation currently showed me as the owner of the ground they were all standing on. A silence followed. Not a theatrical silence, just the quiet that settles when an argument has run out of runway. Evelyn pointed in my direction and asked whether the deputies were simply going to leave me there. Reese looked at her steadily. "Ma'am," he said, "this is his land." I did not say anything. I had not needed to say much of anything in the last 30 minutes, and I was not going to start now. The quiet I kept in that moment was not indifference. It was the only response the situation actually required. Deputy Cole had been quiet for a few minutes, reviewing the survey one more time. She walked away from the truck without announcing what she was looking at and stopped at the property line near the entrance gate. She took out a rangefinder and made a measurement. She studied the position of the archway, then the landscaping border, then the lamp post footings. Then she said without inflection, "Deputy Reese." He walked over. She showed him what she was seeing. If the certified survey was accurate, and it had been prepared by a licensed professional and cross-referenced against county records, then the main entrance archway of Bellweather Ridge extended past my property line by approximately 11 feet at its broadest point. The organization that had spent weeks calling me a trespasser on their land had constructed a permanent, load-bearing structural element of their own entrance on mine. Reese turned back to face Evelyn. He said it calmly and without any apparent satisfaction. "Ma'am, I think your situation here is considerably larger than a trespassing complaint." Deputies Reese and Cole were straightforward about what they could and could not do at a fence line on a Tuesday afternoon. Civil boundary disputes were adjudicated in courtrooms and attorneys' offices, not in the field, and they were not in a position to sort out a full property line conflict on the spot. What they were in a position to do, and did, was establish that there was no legal basis to remove me from a parcel bearing my name in the county's recorded documents, and to note for the official report that I had made formal attempts to resolve the dispute through proper channels well before it reached law enforcement. Evelyn could not credibly maintain from that moment forward that she had been acting in good faith on incomplete information. I showed both deputies what I had brought that day and then everything else I had stored on my phone. Photographs of the HOA signs planted on my land with date and timestamps. The violation notice demanding $250 per day per infraction for activities conducted entirely on my own property. The formal boundary dispute letter my attorney had sent and the HOA's non-responsive reply. Photographs of the 3 missing survey stakes and the depressions left in the soil where they had been. The camera footage from the barn showing the Bellweather Ridge maintenance vehicle entering my parcel after dark on the night before the stakes disappeared. Every email in the chain in chronological order from my single polite note asking for a records correction to Evelyn's letter to the community describing me as a hostile occupant. I showed all of it, organized and dated. Evelyn, who had arrived at this conversation as the accusing party, was now looking for a way to be somewhere else. She had stopped making declarative statements and was giving shorter, quieter responses. Reese told her plainly that he needed her assurance that no HOA personnel would enter the disputed parcel until the matter was resolved through attorneys. She said the HOA would operate on legal advice. He said that was fine, but that in the meantime the record showed me as the owner and any further unauthorized entry would be treated accordingly. Evelyn looked at me with the expression of someone searching for the last line that will restore what they have lost. She said I was trying to take community property. I had stayed quiet through most of the preceding hour, letting the documents carry the weight I had spent weeks loading onto them. But I answered that one directly. No, I said, I am trying to stop the community from taking mine. The news of what had happened at the property line spread through Bellweather Ridge faster than Evelyn would have preferred. Within 48 hours, 2 board members had independently requested to see the HOA's full property documentation, including the original easement records and the underlying survey used to establish the community's perimeter. What they found in the file history was not reassuring. The temporary construction easement, the document Evelyn had been treating as a permanent right of access, had an expiration date that had been explicitly flagged in a letter from the original developer's attorney, sent to the HOA years before I purchased my parcel. That letter was in the HOA's own records. Evelyn had received it. She had not shared it with the board. She had simply continued operating as though the corridor and the maintenance road were unambiguously HOA property, relying on the fact that no one had examined the documents closely enough to say otherwise. The situation deteriorated further from there. The ornamental gate and landscaping that now sat partially on my land had been funded out of HOA dues collected from every Bellweather Ridge homeowner. The board had approved that spending based on an assumption, never formally verified, that the land beneath it belonged to the association. Lydia Vaughn came forward and provided the board with emails she had retained from Warren Beckett in which he had explicitly raised the issue of HOA encroachment and received no formal response. The story had stopped being a conflict between a new neighbor and an established community. It had become a question of whether the HOA's president had knowingly allowed the organization to spend member funds improving and claiming land that the public record did not support them owning. Within a week of the deputy's visit, I received a call from the HOA's legal counsel. He was measured, professional, and notably lacking in the confidence that had characterized every communication I had previously received from Bellweather Ridge. He asked me simply and directly how I wanted to resolve this. I want to be direct about something. I did not want to destroy Bellweather Ridge. I had a genuinely strong legal position, and there were any number of ways to press it aggressively. I could have demanded the immediate physical removal of every structure encroaching on my parcel. The gate archway, the lamp posts, the landscaping, the irrigation line, every footing, every sign. I could have formally closed the maintenance road and forced the HOA to find an alternative route at considerable expense. I could have pursued compensatory damages for the unauthorized use of my land over time, for the violation notices and threatened fines, for the removal of my survey markers, and for the manner in which every interaction had been conducted from the very first day. I understood those options. I also understood that exhausting every available legal weapon in a property dispute is not the same thing as being right, and it is not the same thing as getting the outcome that actually matters. What I proposed was reasonable. I asked the HOA to issue a written formal acknowledgement that my parcel was entirely independent of Bellweather Ridge and subject to no HOA jurisdiction of any kind, recorded and retained permanently. I asked them to rescind every violation notice and fine they had issued and to remove any reference to my property from their compliance records. I asked for a written statement confirming that I had not trespassed on HOA land at any point. I asked them to cover the cost of Graham Pike's return survey and my attorney's time. I asked them to negotiate a proper legally binding easement if they wanted to continue using the maintenance road, a real agreement with a real annual payment formally executed and recorded. I asked for a written apology to me and to the board's own membership for how the matter had been handled, and I asked that the encroachment of the gate and landscaping onto my parcel be resolved either by a properly recorded boundary adjustment at fair market value or by the physical removal of the encroaching elements. None of those requests were punitive. Every single one of them was accountability translated into concrete, documentable action. The HOA's attorney returned within a few days, confirming that the board was willing to negotiate on all points. Evelyn was not. She argued against the easement fee, refused the apology, and maintained that the survey contained an error that a new assessment would correct. The board did not follow her this time. 3 members formally asked her to step down as HOA president before the negotiations were concluded. The stated basis was not the boundary dispute alone. It was the recognition that she had allowed a property records issue to become a racially charged confrontation and had placed the entire community in legal jeopardy, that everyone's dues were now at risk of funding. Evelyn lost the presidency of Bellweather Ridge HOA the way she had tried to remove me from my property, quietly, without a public scene, through a process that simply followed the documentation to its logical conclusion. There were no deputies called, no one was arrested, no scene was made. The documents she had dismissed as irrelevant, the deed, the survey, the easement records, the email chain that began with my single polite request for a correction, those documents were the mechanism behind every outcome that followed. She had not taken them seriously because she did not believe they could apply to someone who looked like me, who drove what I drove, and who stood where I was standing that first afternoon. That assumption was the beginning of her error, and it was the reason its resolution was so complete. A week after the settlement terms were finalized, I received a letter from the Bellweather Ridge HOA. It was addressed, for the first time in the entire history of their correspondence with me, not to occupant and not to neighboring property representative, but to Dear Mr. Holloway, property owner. I read those 3 words standing at the end of my gravel drive. Then I folded the letter, placed it in the evidence folder, and went back to work on the farmhouse. Several months have passed since all of that, and things have settled into something clear and straightforward. The farmhouse is close to finished, new windows in, the roof resurfaced, the kitchen rebuilt from the subfloor, up with reclaimed materials I sourced from 2 other restoration jobs. The HOA signed a proper, legally documented easement for the maintenance road at an annual fee reflecting fair market access value. The gate encroachment was resolved through a small recorded transaction that adjusted that corner of the property line, documented everything at the county level properly, and closed the matter without further dispute. There are no more no trespassing signs planted on my land. There are no more violation notices in my mailbox. Graham's orange survey stakes stand in the ground where he set them, undisturbed. Lydia Vaughn stops by occasionally when she is out walking in the evening, and we have had several conversations across the fence about the history of this part of the county. How the land used to be parceled, what it looked like before the subdivisions came in, what gets lost when people stop paying close attention to the records behind things. Some of the Bellweather Ridge residents who had avoided eye contact during the weeks after Evelyn's community letter now give a wave from their cars when they pass on the county road. I do not need each one of them to individually account for how they handled that period. What I need is simpler than that. I need the record to reflect what is true, and it does. There is something I return to when I am out on the property in the early morning before the work crews arrive, when it is just me and the land and the light coming low through the eastern tree line. No single thing about how I present to the world, the truck I drive, the clothes I work in, the way I carry myself on a job site, tells anyone what name is on file at the county courthouse. Evelyn Carrington made a decision about who I was and what I was entitled to own based entirely on what she saw in the first 30 seconds after I stepped out of my vehicle. And she was wrong in a way the public record proved conclusively, in front of law enforcement, in front of her own board, and in front of a neighborhood that had to live with the consequences of that assumption. A pickup truck does not tell you what someone has in their bank account. Work clothes do not tell you what someone has built with their hands over 20 years. And the color of someone's skin tells you nothing, nothing at all, about what name is written on a deed at the county courthouse. One afternoon, weeks after everything had been settled, Evelyn drove past the property on the county road. She slowed as she came alongside the fence. I was working on a post near the road, and we saw each other clearly across the distance. She stopped the car. We looked at each other for several seconds. No HOA board standing behind her, no deputies to call, no violation notices left to issue, no leverage of any kind remaining. She did not apologize. What she said was, "Looks like you got what you wanted." I thought about the farmhouse behind me, the barn, the survey stakes standing firm in the ground where Graham had driven them, and the deed recorded at the courthouse with my name on it, 14.7 acres of North Georgia that had been mine from the moment the transfer was filed. I said, "No, I already had what I wanted." I pointed down at the earth beneath my boots. "I just made you admit it was mine." She drove away. I walked back across my land to the survey stake near the northern fence line, the one Graham had reset after the first ones were pulled, the one whose orange flag caught the afternoon light clean and clear. I knelt down and checked that it was solid. It was. This was the land. These were the boundaries. This was the deed. And Darius Holloway's name was on every single one of them. Jake will bull drain. End of script. G will blear blained.